November 10th, 1444. On the shores of Varna, a 20-year-old king charged headlong into the heart of the Ottoman army. In moments, he was thrown from his horse, surrounded by janissaries, and beheaded. His head lifted high as a trophy above the smoke and blood. This was the fate of Władysław III, King of Poland and Hungary, a monarch who died before he ever truly ruled. His body was never found, leaving behind only rumors, shadows, and a legend of loss. He was not born to carry the weight of empires. Władysław, later remembered as Władysław III, came into the world on October 31st, 1424, in Krakow, Poland. The city itself was a jewel of medieval Europe, crowned with Gothic spires and cobbled streets that echoed with the clatter of merchants, priests, and nobles. But for the child, there was no such thing as ordinary life. His father was Władysław II Jagiełło, the king who had defeated the Teutonic Knights at Grunwald and stitched together a fragile Polish-Lithuanian union. His mother was Sophia of Halszany, a Lithuanian princess whose presence in court was viewed with suspicion by powerful nobles. The boy was barely 10 when his father died. Childhood ended the moment the crown touched his head. In theory, he was King of Poland. In reality, he was a pawn. Too young to speak, too young to decide, too young even to resist the pull of advisors, magnates, and foreign clerics who circled him like wolves. The crown that glittered upon his hair was not a blessing, but a burden heavy enough to bend a grown man. For a child, it was almost unbearable. The regency was governed by his mother Sophia and a council of nobles. She was protective, fiercely so, and determined to keep her son alive in a world where boys who wore crowns often died before they became men. Yet, she was also isolated. The Polish nobility resented her foreign origin, doubted her ability, and sought to control the boy through their own factions. In the royal halls of Wawel Castle, the child king walked among shadows, men whispering promises of loyalty, all while sharpening knives for the day power shifted. It is easy to imagine him wandering those drafty chambers, gazing out of narrow windows at the Vistula River, longing for a life he could never have. Other boys learned to hunt, to ride, to wrestle in the fields without consequence. Władysław learned to bow politely, to recite prayers, to wear a sword that he could barely lift. Childhood was not a season of innocence. It was an apprenticeship in fear and duty. The church was ever present. Priests spoke to him of destiny, of divine will, of kings chosen by God to defend Christendom. In their eyes, he was not a boy, but a vessel, a symbol to be molded into the perfect Christian ruler. Scripture and sermons pressed upon him more heavily than any armor he would later wear. The walls of the chapel became his classroom, the Latin chants his lullabies. And yet, there is something tragic in his silence. The chronicles describe him as handsome, pious, courageous. But there are no words of his own, no letters that reveal the boy behind the crown. His childhood was not recorded in laughter, in mischief, in youthful rebellion. It was recorded in decrees signed by others in his name, in treaties sealed with his title, in armies raised under a king who had no voice in their making. One can almost see the boy king at a feast. Golden goblets raised around him, nobles boasting of battles, priests muttering blessings. And there he sits, a figurehead at the center, eyes wide, face pale, hands folded in ritual obedience. Did he dream then of escape? Did he imagine himself riding alone through forests, free of the suffocating cloak of kingship? History gives no answer. Silence is all that remains. By the time he turned 12, he was already the subject of European politics. Messages from foreign courts arrived with offers, threats, and alliances. His youth was a resource others sought to exploit. To the Hungarians, he could be a candidate for their vacant throne. To the papacy, he could be a soldier for Christ against the Turks. To his own nobles, he was both shield and puppet, protection for their privileges, justification for their ambitions. In many ways, his destiny was sealed before he reached manhood. The boy who was denied a childhood would later be denied a future. For all the crowns and titles that glittered around him, Władysław III never belonged to himself. He belonged to the machinery of power, the nobility that sought to control him, the church that sought to sanctify him, and the wars that demanded his blood. When we speak of his later recklessness on the battlefield, charging headlong into Janissary lines, perhaps we must remember this childhood. A boy raised in silence, never allowed to be ordinary, pressed from his earliest years into the role of savior. When the world told him that he was God's chosen, when priests spoke of martyrdom as glory, what else could he believe? The tragedy of Władysław III did not begin at Varna. It began in Krakow, in the cold corridors of Wawel Castle, when a child of 10 was forced to sit on a throne too large for him. It began with the theft of his childhood, replaced by crowns he could not lift, words he could not yet speak, and expectations no man, let alone a boy, could ever truly meet. The story of Władysław III cannot be told without the second crown that would press upon his brow. If being King of Poland was already a burden too heavy for his youth, then the crown of Hungary would be the chain that sealed his fate. It began in 1440, with the death of Albert II of Habsburg, King of Hungary, Bohemia, and the Romans. Albert's sudden passing left his widow, Elizabeth of Luxembourg, pregnant with a posthumous child. The nobles of Hungary, divided and restless, faced an impossible choice: wait for the unborn son of Albert, or place their trust in another monarch who could lead immediately. The Polish court saw an opportunity. Władysław, barely 16, could extend his influence beyond Krakow, carrying the banner of both Poland and Hungary. It was an idea that appealed not only to Polish nobles, but to the papacy, which was desperate to find a champion against the advancing Ottomans. And so, Władysław, a boy who had never yet proven himself in war or governance, was thrust onto the stage of Europe as a dual monarch. In July 1440, he was crowned King of Hungary in Székesfehérvár, the traditional coronation city, even though Elizabeth of Luxembourg had secretly crowned her infant son, Ladislaus, with the royal crown beforehand. Two kings, two claims, one throne split in blood and intrigue. The crowning of Władysław was not just a ceremony, it was a gamble. In one moment, the fragile teenager became the ruler of two kingdoms, stretched between the Baltic and the Danube, responsible for borders threatened by one of the most powerful empires on earth. He inherited not peace but conflict, not unity but rivalry. In Poland, the nobility viewed his new title with suspicion. They feared that the king's Hungarian obligations would draw away resources and attention, leaving Polish lands vulnerable. In Hungary, Elizabeth's loyalists rejected him, rallying around the infant Ladislaus, whose claim was supported by the formidable Habsburg dynasty. It was a recipe for civil war, and indeed, Hungary descended into factional strife. Imagine the young king, scarcely able to grow a beard, seated at a table surrounded by warlords and bishops, each demanding his ear. To the south, Ottoman raids burned villages. To the west, the Habsburg threat loomed. To the north, Polish magnates warned him not to forget who had given him their crown. The boy was no longer just a king. He was a rope pulled taut between factions, each tug threatening to snap him in two. And yet, there was grandeur in it. Chroniclers describe Władysław as tall, graceful, and almost angelic in appearance. To his supporters, he seemed a figure of destiny, a king who could unite Central Europe and defend Christendom. To the Church, he was a vessel for holy war. To poets, he was the embodiment of youthful hope. To cynics, he was merely a pawn draped in velvet. Still, Władysław tried to step into the role expected of him. He rode at the head of his armies, attended councils, and offered himself as the visible symbol of resistance to the Ottomans. But symbols cannot lead without substance. Every decision was shaped by advisors, powerful magnates in Poland, seasoned lords in Hungary, and envoys from the Vatican. Each pressed their agenda onto the young king, who nodded, listened, and obeyed, often with more faith than foresight. The double crown also meant a double burden of expectation. In Krakow, the people wanted security and independence from German and Teutonic pressures. In Buda, the nobles wanted a warrior who would stand at the frontier of Christendom. In Rome, the Pope wanted a martyr king to lead a crusade. And in every whisper, in every decree, the boy's own will seemed to vanish further into the shadows. This was the tragic paradox of Władysław III. He was given more power than almost any youth of his time, yet he possessed the least freedom of all. His name appeared on treaties, his image on coins, his crown above every throne room, but his voice was never truly heard. Historians often compare him to a candle lit at both ends. In Poland, he had to burn for unity. In Hungary, he had to burn for survival. The flame was bright, almost blinding in its promise. But it could not last. When he rode through the streets of Buda, crowds cheered. They saw not the teenager with uncertainty in his eyes, but a monarch in shining armor, a shield against the Turks, a chosen one sent by God. They did not see the weight of expectation pressing down, the isolation of youth swallowed by ceremony. They did not see how fragile the hope truly was. 2 crowns, 2 realms, 1 boy. It was a triumph on parchment, but in reality, it was the prelude to tragedy. By binding Poland and Hungary under a single ruler, Europe had created its hero in waiting. But heroes demand sacrifice, and in this case, the sacrifice would be Władysław himself. The double crown gave him glory and name. It also gave him enemies in every direction. More than that, it robbed him of the one thing a boy of 16 might have wished for most: time. Time to grow, time to learn, time to live. Instead, he was cast headlong into the storm, a figure draped in royal robes but stripped of innocence. And so the boy became king twice over. But in becoming king of 2 realms, he became prisoner of both. His story was no longer his own. It was the story of Europe's desperate gamble against the tide of Ottoman power, a gamble that would end not in triumph, but in Varna, with a sword flashing through smoke. The double crown might have given Władysław prestige, but it also made him the perfect target for the most ambitious project of Christendom: a crusade to halt the Ottoman advance. The call did not come from Krakow or Buda. It came from Rome. Pope Eugenius IV was a man under siege, not by swords, but by legitimacy. The papacy had been weakened by schism and rival councils that sought to undermine his authority. He needed a grand gesture, something that would prove once again that Rome still stood as the heart of Christendom. The Ottomans, pressing deeper into the Balkans, offered him both a threat and an opportunity. If a holy war could be launched and won, the Pope would reclaim his prestige. For such a war, he needed a champion. And in the eyes of the Vatican, no figure seemed more fitting than the young Władysław III, King of Poland, King of Hungary, defender of two Catholic realms, perched on the edge of Ottoman expansion. A boy of 16 could be molded, guided, sanctified. More importantly, he could be sacrificed if need be. Envoys arrived in Buda carrying papal bulls written in ornate Latin. They promised glory, indulgence, and salvation not just for the king, but for every soldier who marched under the cross. They painted a vision of triumph. Władysław at the head of a crusading host, banners of Christ fluttering, the crescent of Islam shattered before the might of Christian unity. The words were intoxicating, not only to the king, but to those around him. Yet the reality was far more complex. The nobility of Hungary was divided. Some lords supported Elizabeth of Luxembourg and her infant son, Ladislaus the Posthumous, backed by the Habsburgs. Others saw in Władysław a chance to break from Habsburg dominance and secure papal favor. For both sides, the idea of a crusade was a tool, a means to secure legitimacy, to cement alliances, to gain wealth through papal subsidies. And so, the boy king was pushed forward. His counselors whispered of duty. His bishops preached of eternal reward. His soldiers dreamed of plunder. The weight of their hopes fell squarely upon his shoulders, though he himself had little say. He was not asked whether he wanted to be Christendom's sword. He was told he already was. In the chronicles, Władysław is portrayed as devout, deeply pious, and eager to embrace the role. Perhaps he was. After all, how could a teenager resist the intoxicating promise that he was chosen by God? How could he deny the vision of himself leading armies, conquering unbelievers, ascending not just as a king, but as a savior? But behind the veneer of faith, one sees the manipulation. The Pope needed a figurehead. The nobles needed a leader. The church needed a martyr. And in Władysław, they found all three, compressed into a single fragile body. The crusade was not just about faith. It was about politics. Venice promised ships, but only if it could secure favorable trade agreements. Burgundy pledged knights, but demanded recognition of its own claims in Europe. Even within Hungary, lords bartered their loyalty for titles and land. The Holy War was wrapped in sermons, but beneath the cloth of religion lay the steel of ambition. And Władysław? He stood at the center, silent. One can imagine him in the grand halls of Buda, listening as papal legates thundered about the will of God, as nobles drew maps on tables, as generals spoke of cavalry charges and fortresses. He would nod, his youthful face lit by candlelight, and the men around him would see what they wanted to see: a king ready to lead. But was he? The boy had never commanded an army. He had never faced the terror of a real battlefield. He had grown up surrounded by prayers, not war cries. And yet, within months, he would be placed at the head of a campaign stretching across the Balkans against one of the most disciplined and fearsome armies in the world. The manipulation of his youth is the most haunting part of this chapter. Had he been older, more seasoned, he might have resisted. But at 16, 17, how could he argue with priests who told him martyrdom was the highest honor? How could he defy the Pope, the vicar of Christ, who promised eternal salvation in return for his sword? How could he stand against the tide of expectation when every hand around him pushed him forward? And so, the crusade became inevitable. Letters spread across Europe calling for knights to take up the cross. Preachers filled marketplaces with fiery sermons. The name of Władysław III became tied not to his kingdoms, but to a holy war. He was no longer just a king. He was the vessel of Christendom's last hope. But hope is fragile when built on the back of a boy. Beneath the grandeur, beneath the orations, beneath the gilded promises, lay the simple truth. The armies of Christendom were fractured, underfunded, and ill-prepared. The Ottomans, under Sultan Murad II, were strong, experienced, and disciplined. The scales were already tipped. But the papal vision demanded faith, not arithmetic. It is here that Władysław's tragedy deepens. He was not merely manipulated into war, he was celebrated for it. Every step he took was hailed as heroic. Every prayer whispered over him declared him chosen. And so, when he rode out to meet the Ottomans, he did so not as a boy uncertain of his place, but as a king convinced by all the world that his destiny was sealed in heaven. The call of the Pope was never just a summons. It was a chain, forged in Rome, carried across mountains, locked around the neck of a boy in Buda. And once fastened, there was no escape. The year was 1443, and Europe trembled before the crescent of the Ottomans. The Balkans burned in raids. Villages fell into silence beneath the hooves of Turkish horsemen. Fortresses collapsed under siege. For Christian rulers across the continent, the fear was not simply of conquest, but of extinction. They looked eastward to the boy crowned with 2 kingdoms, and they saw not just a king, they saw a miracle waiting to happen. Władysław III became the banner of that miracle. He was young, handsome, devout. Chroniclers spoke of his calm bearing, his quiet smile, his belief that God's will flowed through his every step. For a Europe desperate for symbols, he became almost saintly. To Poles, he was the heir of Grunwald, the boy who would finish what his father had begun, defending Christendom's frontier. To Hungarians, he was the warrior king who would hold the Danube. To Rome, he was the sword of God. In 1443, the so-called Long Campaign began. It was conceived by John Hunyadi, the brilliant Hungarian commander, and blessed by Pope Eugenius IV. Hunyadi was the iron fist to Władysław's gilded image. Where the king brought legitimacy and faith, Hunyadi brought strategy and steel. Together, at least in theory, they formed the perfect pair, the symbol and the soldier. The army was a patchwork of nations. Hungarians, Poles, Wallachians under Władysław Dracul, Serbs under Durad Brankovic, and even crusaders from beyond the Alps. Each came with their own banners, their own tongues, their own ambitions. It was less a unified force than a coalition bound by desperation. Venice promised ships. The papacy promised indulgences. Merchants promised loans in exchange for spoils. The air was thick with hope and illusion. At first, the campaign seemed blessed. The Christian army marched south through the Balkans, striking deep into Ottoman territory. Towns fell, garrisons crumbled. Winter snows descended, but still the armies pressed on, banners of the cross snapping against icy winds. Songs of triumph carried across Europe. The boy king of Poland and Hungary had struck fear into the Turks. Chroniclers spoke of him as the new Alexander, a second Charlemagne, a warrior anointed by heaven. Yet behind the victories lay a harsher truth. The Ottomans were not broken. Sultan Murad II was no longer a young ruler distracted by internal strife. He was a seasoned general who understood the tides of war. The Turkish army withdrew strategically, conserving strength, bleeding the crusaders through distance, hunger, and frost. Each mile southward stretched the coalition thinner. Supplies dwindled, horses weakened, alliances frayed. The illusion of unstoppable triumph began to show cracks. Still, the image of Władysław shone brightly. He rode at the head of the cavalry, the cross pinned to his armor, his face the embodiment of youthful zeal. To the soldiers, it seemed as if heaven itself rode with them. Priests proclaimed miracles. Even setbacks were spun as divine tests of endurance. In a Europe where plague and famine had often crushed faith, this crusade rekindled the belief that God had not abandoned them. But hope is a dangerous fuel. It blinds as much as it inspires. The victories of 1443 emboldened Rome. The Pope declared the crusade a triumph. Venice and Genoa whispered of dominance in trade routes if the Turks were driven from the Black Sea. Hungarian nobles imagined themselves masters of Balkan lands. And Władysław himself, still barely 19, was told at every step that he was chosen, that he could not fail, that God had written his victory into eternity. Perhaps it is here we see the roots of Varna, a boy inflated into a myth, convinced of invincibility, wrapped in the intoxicating praise of priests and poets. Each prayer was another stone in the tower of his destiny. And towers, as history often shows, collapse from their own weight. By early 1444, the Crusaders returned to Buda. The long campaign had not achieved decisive victory, but it had not been a disaster either. Treaties were discussed, truces whispered. Even Sultan Murad, weary of war, considered peace. For a moment, Europe exhaled. Perhaps the danger could be postponed. Perhaps the fragile hope could endure without further bloodshed. But peace was fragile, and politics cruel. Rome refused to let the war end. The Pope's legates urged Władysław onward. To halt now, they said, would be cowardice. To sign peace with the infidel would be betrayal. The boy king, with fire in his veins and a cross on his chest, listened. Once again, the weight of Christendom bore down on him. Hope had turned into demand. Władysław was no longer allowed to be cautious. He could not rest. He could not retreat. Europe had crowned him not just as king, but as savior. And saviors, history teaches us, are rarely granted long lives. In the spring of 1444, plans for a new campaign began. This one would not march cautiously through mountains. It would strike directly at the heart by the shores of the Black Sea. The place was Varna. The promise was glory. The cost, though unseen, was already written in fate. The boy who had been denied childhood was now denied caution. His every step was measured not in reason, but in prophecy. And prophecy, once unleashed, demands fulfillment, no matter how tragic. The summer of 1444 was a season of uneasy promises. In June at Szeged, a peace treaty was signed between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. It was a truce that could have spared thousands of lives. Sultan Murad II, weary of endless war and anxious to secure his throne against rivals, agreed to terms that many considered generous. Territories would be restored, Christian prisoners released, and the Danube frontiers stabilized. For a moment, it seemed the storm might pass. But peace is often an illusion when faith and politics collide. The ink on the treaty was hardly dry when papal legates arrived in Buda, carrying messages from Rome. Their words were sharp, cloaked in holy authority. Treaties with the infidel were invalid in the eyes of God. A promise to Muslims, they declared, was no promise at all. Breaking such an oath was not sin, but virtue. John Hunyadi, the seasoned commander who had led the long campaign, counseled caution. He knew the strength of the Ottomans, the discipline of their janissaries, the exhaustion of their own armies. Yet the papal legates pressed the young king relentlessly. So did Venetian envoys, eager to expand their grip on Black Sea trade. They spoke of glory, of destiny, of crowns secured by conquest. And so, at 19 years old, Władysław III was forced to choose. On one hand, peace, a fragile respite that might give him time to secure his kingdoms. On the other, war, a gamble that promised eternal glory if he triumphed, but ruin if he failed. He chose war, or rather, war was chosen for him, by the chorus of priests, diplomats, and magnates who left him no space to resist. In August, the crusading army began to assemble. It was smaller than the hosts Europe had dreamed of. Perhaps 20,000 men at most, Hungarians, Poles, Wallachians under Vlad the Big Dracul, and a smattering of crusaders from further west. Venice promised naval support in the Black Sea, though their commitment was lukewarm and their motives mercenary. Still, the army carried with it an aura of righteousness, the banners of the cross gleaming in the summer sun. The march south was both triumphal and ominous. Villagers lined the roads to see the boy king ride past, his armor polished, his banner-bearers carrying the double cross of Hungary and the white eagle of Poland. Priests chanted hymns, soldiers sang of victory. Yet behind the music, behind the prayers, marched hunger and uncertainty. Supplies were thin, pay was late. Many soldiers marched more from desperation than from faith. By September, the army reached the Balkans. The heat of summer faded into the chill of autumn. Dust turned to mud. Wagons broke, horses stumbled. The dream of a crusade was grinding into the reality of exhaustion. Yet still, the king pressed on. Władysław himself rode at the front, youthful and radiant, the embodiment of the crusade's hope. Chroniclers tell us he carried himself with solemnity, as if aware that history was watching. Did he believe then that he was chosen by God to deliver victory? Or did he sense, bow in the silence of night, that he was being driven into a trap not of his own making? History is silent. But the decisions made by those around him gave him little chance to turn back. Meanwhile, across the empire, Sultan Murad II was pulled from semi-retirement. Having abdicated briefly in favor of his son Mehmed, he had hoped for peace. But when news reached him that the Christians had broken their treaty and were marching south, he returned to command. Murad gathered his forces, far more numerous, perhaps 60,000 strong. Seasoned janissaries, Anatolian cavalry, Balkan auxiliaries, a force designed not for desperation, but for annihilation. As the two armies approached Varna, the disparity was clear. The Christians were outnumbered 3-1. Yet they marched with a kind of reckless faith, convinced that heaven would tip the scales. The priests spoke of Gideon's army defeating multitudes. They spoke of David against Goliath. They whispered that martyrdom was greater than survival. In the early days of November, the Crusaders reached the Black Sea coast near Varna. The city lay ahead, nestled against the waters. Behind it stretched the Balkan mountains. There was no easy retreat. They were caught between sea and stone, locked in a battlefield chosen not by them, but by fate. The night before battle, campfires dotted the plain. Soldiers sharpened blades, whispered prayers, or stared silently into the dark. Priests moved through the tents with crucifixes raised high, offering absolution. Some knights wrote final letters, never to be delivered. Others drank, laughed too loudly, masking their fear. And the king? Władysław, only 20, sat in his command tent, surrounded by generals. Maps spread before him, torches flickering. Hunyadi urged discipline. Hold the line, wait for the Ottomans to break themselves upon Christian defenses. The papal legates urged boldness. Strike at the heart, for God would deliver the Sultan into their hands. The boy listened to both. The choice he would make the next day would decide the fate of nations, and his own. Varna was not just a battlefield. It was a crucible, where youthful faith would collide with the iron discipline of empire. The road that had begun in Krakow, that had passed through Buda, through papal chambers and Balkan valleys, ended here, on this narrow plain by the sea. When dawn came, the horizon burned with the light of thousands of torches. The Ottomans had arrived. Their banners stretched like a forest of crescents. Their drums thundered across the earth. The Christians formed their lines, banners of the cross rising into the morning wind. It was November 10th, 1444. The Battle of Varna was about to begin, and with it, the last chapter of Władysław III's brief and tragic reign. The morning of November 10th, 1444, broke cold and sharp over the plains near Varna. A sea wind rolled in from the Black Sea, carrying with it the smell of salt and the promise of blood. The armies of Christendom stirred from their uneasy sleep, banners creaking in the breeze. Priests moved among the ranks, raising crucifixes and chanting absolutions. Some soldiers knelt in prayer, lips moving silently, while others adjusted harnesses and checked weapons with trembling hands. Across the field, the Ottoman host unfurled like an iron tide. Their numbers dwarfed the Crusaders 3-1. Rows of janissaries stood in perfect formation, their discipline unmatched in Europe. Cavalry wings stretched outward, dark against the horizon. Above them flew the green banners of Islam and the red standard of Sultan Murad II. Drums thundered, their deep rhythm echoing like a heartbeat across the battlefield. And yet, in those first hours, hope lived. The Crusaders, though fewer, were not without strength. Their lines were commanded by John Hunyadi, the Iron General of Hungary, who understood the art of war as few others did. He placed his men carefully, Hungarians at the center, Poles alongside them, Wallachians and Serbs anchoring the flanks. Behind them rode the young king himself, Władysław III, clad in gleaming armor, the cross displayed proudly on his chest. The battle began with a clash of cavalry on the wings. Christian knights charged, lances lowered, horses pounding the earth. For a moment, the field erupted in chaos and dust, steel meeting steel, cries of war mingling with the screams of the dying. Against all odds, the Crusaders pushed back. Ottoman cavalry faltered. The left wing of Murad's army staggered under the furious assault. Cheers erupted among the Christians. Perhaps, just perhaps, victory was possible. Władysław rode among his men, lifting their spirits. Chroniclers describe him as radiant, fearless, his youthful face shining beneath his helmet. To the soldiers, he was no longer just a boy. He was the embodiment of divine courage, proof that God favored their cause. When he lifted his sword, voices rose with him. When he called upon Christ's name, hearts beat faster. And in those first hours, the illusion of triumph seemed real. Hunyadi's strategy worked. Christian infantry held their lines against repeated assaults. The janissaries, usually unbreakable, were pressed back in places. Standards fell. The Ottoman host, though vast, wavered at its edges. To the Crusaders, it felt as if heaven itself had descended, guiding their arms, blinding their enemies. The sight of the Ottomans faltering was intoxicating. Priests proclaimed miracles, trumpets blared, soldiers cried out that the Sultan himself was about to fall. In that fleeting moment, hope soared higher than it had in years of war. It was as though the prophecies were true, that the boy king had indeed been chosen by God to deliver Christendom from its darkest foe. But battles are not won by faith alone. The Ottomans were veterans of countless wars. Murad II himself, though reluctant to return from retirement, was no novice. He steadied his troops, rallying his janissaries with calm authority. Reserves poured into weak points. The immense numbers of the Ottoman host began to tell. Where one wave fell back, another surged forward. Slowly, the advantage of discipline and scale pushed against the fragile hope of the Christians. Still, Władysław believed. He rode closer to the lines, urging his men onward, his youthful courage burning like fire. He had been told since boyhood that he was chosen, that martyrdom was glory, that hesitation was sin. And so, hesitation never touched him. He saw only victory or death, nothing in between. From a distance, the battle looked like a storm. The Christian lines bent, but did not yet break. The Ottomans pressed harder. The air filled with the crack of arrows, the crash of steel, the cries of the wounded. Dust and smoke turned the morning sun into a pale disk above the chaos. Men fought blind, guided only by the shouts of commanders and the press of bodies around them. In the midst of this fury, a dangerous idea took root. If the Sultan could be struck down, if Murad himself were killed, the Ottoman host might collapse. It was a tempting vision, a single stroke to end the war, to secure eternal fame. Hunyadi counseled patience, urging the king to hold the line, to trust discipline over impulse. But priests and legates whispered otherwise. They spoke of destiny, of divine command, of the chance for eternal victory. And the boy listened. For a brief span, it seemed within reach. Christian cavalry drove deeper into the Ottoman flanks. Standards toppled. Cries of panic rose among the enemy. The impossible seemed possible. Władysław's heart surged with conviction. Perhaps he could end it all with one strike. Perhaps this was the moment heaven had promised him. Thus the stage was set. The fleeting moment of triumph, so bright and intoxicating, was the spark that would ignite disaster. For in believing too much in emotion, Władysław would soon step beyond strategy and into legend. A legend carved not by victory, but by tragedy. The battlefield at Varna had become a crucible of faith and fire. And at its center stood a boy in armor, convinced he was immortal. The plain of Varna was thick with smoke. For hours, the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves had shaken the earth. Dust clung to armor, blood darkened the trampled soil, and the cries of the dying drowned beneath the drums of war. The crusaders, though outnumbered, had not broken. In some places, they had even pushed the enemy back. And in the haze of battle, a dangerous thought began to gleam like a sword edge. Perhaps they could win. Władysław III believed it most of all. He had seen Ottoman cavalry scatter. He had heard priests cry out that the Sultan was faltering. He had felt the surge of victory ripple through his men. To him, it was not just a battle. It was destiny unfolding. Had he not been crowned with 2 kingdoms? Had not the Pope himself blessed him as Christendom's champion? What glory could be greater than to strike down Murad II himself? John Hunyadi thought otherwise. The seasoned general had fought the Ottomans for years. He knew the strength of their janissaries, the unyielding heart of the Sultan's host. Again and again, he warned restraint. "Hold the line," he urged. "Victory will come by patience. Let the enemy bleed themselves against us." But Hunyadi's voice, firm and pragmatic, struggled against the tide of prophecy and youthful fire. The papal legates, burning with zeal, whispered to the king, "Now is the hour God has chosen. Strike at the serpent's head, and the body will die." Their words were honeyed with scripture, sharpened with urgency. And the boy, whose ears had always been filled with promises of destiny, listened. It was then, amid the smoke and chaos, that Władysław made the decision that would define his life and end it. Gathering a small band of his heavy cavalry, perhaps only 500 strong, he spurred his horse forward. His banner-bearer raised the cross, trumpets blared. The young king cried out for Christ and for victory. And with that, he charged directly into the core of the Ottoman army. The sight was magnificent. A flash of silver armor and fluttering banners, horses thundering toward the heart of the Janissary lines. To his men, it seemed like a vision from legend. The boy king transformed into a holy warrior, fearless and unstoppable. Soldiers cheered, believing they were witnessing the strike that would shatter the Ottoman host. But to Murad's veterans, it was folly. The Janissaries, disciplined and immovable, locked their shields and braced their spears. They had seen reckless charges before. They knew how to turn courage into carnage. The clash came like a hammer on stone. Horses screamed, pierced by pikes. Riders fell, dragged down into the press of blades. The king's guard fought fiercely, cutting deep into the Janissary line, but they were swallowed by numbers. Steel clanged, shields splintered, cries turned to screams. Still, Władysław pressed on, convinced that if he could only reach the Sultan's tent, victory would be his. Hunyadi, seeing the disaster unfold, tried desperately to rally support. He shouted for the infantry to cover the king, for cavalry to follow. But the lines were stretched thin, the battle raging everywhere. By the time reinforcements stirred, it was too late. The king had already vanished into the maw of the Ottoman core. In the chaos, his banner fell. The white eagle of Poland and the double cross of Hungary disappeared into smoke. To the soldiers watching from afar, it was as if the sun itself had gone dark. Accounts of what happened next differ. Some say Władysław fought like a lion, cutting down Janissaries with his sword until his horse was slain beneath him. Others say he was dragged from his saddle almost immediately, swallowed in a sea of blades. All agree on the ending. The boy king was surrounded, struck down, and decapitated. His head was raised high on a spear, shown to both armies as proof of his fall. For the crusaders, it was the shattering of hope. One moment they believed victory within reach. The next, they saw their king's head above the smoke. Despair tore through the ranks. Men fled. The coalition collapsed. What had begun as a battle of faith ended as a rout of ruin. For the Ottomans, it was vindication. Murad Sen, though shaken by the ferocity of the crusaders, had triumphed once more. His disciplined Janissaries had broken the illusion of divine invincibility. And in doing so, they had destroyed not just an army, but a legend. The decision to charge, so brief in the making, lasted only minutes in execution. Yet it undid years of preparation, months of marching, and centuries of hope. It transformed a king from savior into martyr, from monarch into ghost. And therein lies the tragedy. Władysław was not foolish, not cowardly. He was young, and too steeped in the rhetoric of destiny to see the difference between courage and recklessness. To him, the charge was not madness, it was faith. To those who urged him forward, it was not folly, it was prophecy fulfilled. But prophecy, as history shows, often demands blood. And on that plain by the Black Sea, it demanded the head of a 20-year-old king. The reckless decision ended his reign in a heartbeat. Yet it gave birth to something far stranger, a legend that would refuse to die long after his body was gone. The charge had been dazzling, but its brilliance lasted only moments. Once the dust settled, all that remained was ruin. The Janissaries, veterans forged in decades of war, closed their ranks with mechanical precision. They had seen reckless kings before, and they knew how to kill them. Władysław's heavy cavalry slammed into their lines, but the spears held. Horses reared, impaled, screaming in panic. Knights toppled into the press of steel, swallowed by a tide of blades. The boy king himself rode deeper, his banner-bearer clutching the double cross of Hungary. For an instant, it seemed he might break through. But then the standard fell, and when it fell, so did hope. Accounts of the king's final moments are shrouded in contradiction, as if even history struggled to look too closely at the death of a boy barely 20 years old. Some say he was pulled from his horse, hacked to pieces by janissaries who recognized the crown on his helm. Others insist he fought until the very end, swinging his sword in desperation before being overwhelmed. Still others claim he was captured alive and executed on the spot, his head severed in ritual display. What is certain is this: the young monarch never returned from that charge. His body disappeared in the storm of war. What remained, his severed head, was raised on a spear for all to see. The effect was immediate. Across the battlefield, the crusader lines wavered. Soldiers who had held firm for hours now faltered. They looked toward the center, expecting to see their king leading the charge. Instead, they saw his head swaying above the janissaries. Crimson dripping from his hair, a collective gasp swept the Christian host, followed by silence. And then chaos. The rout began at the flanks. Wallachian and Serbian auxiliaries, already weary and distrustful, broke away. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Men threw down weapons, trampling one another in the desperate rush to escape. Horses bolted, wagons overturned, standards fell. What had been a crusading army only minutes before dissolved into a fleeing mob. John Hunyadi, the Iron General, fought desperately to salvage the situation. He rallied what men he could, retreating toward the rear, covering the flight of survivors. His discipline saved fragments of the army, but even he could not restore order once the symbol of their cause was gone. Without the king, there was no unity, no faith. Only survival remained. The battlefield itself became a slaughterhouse. Ottoman cavalry swept into the fleeing crusaders, cutting them down in waves. Archers rained death upon retreating columns. The plain near Varna, so recently alive with chants of triumph, became a sea of corpses. Blood mingled with the churned mud, staining the earth red. As night fell, the cries of the wounded echoed across the fields. Fires burned where wagons had been overturned. Looters moved among the dead, stripping armor, searching for gold. For the survivors, scattered and broken, the memory of Varna would be a scar that never healed. But the greatest wound was the absence of the king's body. His head had been displayed by the Ottomans, but his corpse was never recovered. Some claimed it was trampled beyond recognition, lost in the mire of the battlefield. Others believed it was carried away in secret, hidden by victors or traitors. For the Christian survivors, the uncertainty was unbearable. A king was gone, but no tomb could be built, no funeral rites performed. Only rumor remained. In the days that followed, stories spread like smoke. Some swore they had seen Władysław's body dragged to the Ottoman camp, buried in Adrianople as a trophy. Others whispered that he had escaped the field, wandering into exile under another name. Still others said he had been taken alive, chained and humiliated in distant lands. The truth was buried beneath fear and legend. For the people of Poland and Hungary, the shock was immeasurable. Their king had led them to war at the urging of pope and priest, only to vanish without a grave. In Krakow, bells tolled, but no coffin entered Wawel Cathedral. In Buda, nobles argued over succession, while widows mourned husbands who would never return. A kingdom without a body was a kingdom without closure. On the Ottoman side, the victory was complete. Sultan Murad II had crushed the last great crusade of the Middle Ages. The boy king who had dared challenge him lay headless, his army scattered, his dream extinguished. The crescent banner still flew over the Balkans, and the frontier of Christendom retreated in silence. Yet even Murad could not erase the strangeness of it all. The fall of a king at 20 was not just a victory, it was an omen. And in Europe, omens breed myths. The death of Władysław III was not simply the death of a monarch. It was the death of an idea. That youthful zeal and divine favor could triumph over the iron of empire. But because his body was never found, that death never felt complete. His story was not finished in blood. It lingered in rumor, in legend, in silence. The battlefield at Varna became more than a site of defeat. It became a wound in the European imagination. A place where hope turned to dust, where a boy became a martyr, and where history slipped into myth. And as night closed over the blood-soaked plain, the legend of Władysław III, king without a body, martyr without a tomb, began to take shape. History records many kings who died on the battlefield, but few whose deaths left so many questions. For most, there are tombs, relics, graves that anchor memory in stone. For Władysław III, there was nothing. No coffin brought back to Krakow. No body laid beneath the vaults of Wawel Cathedral. Only absence. The absence was itself a wound. In medieval Europe, where ritual and burial were essential to the order of things, a missing corpse was more than an inconvenience. It was a rupture in the fabric of belief. Without a body, how could the people mourn? Without a tomb, how could the nation remember? The silence left space for something else to grow. Rumor. The Ottomans claimed the boy king's head had been taken to Murad II's court as proof of victory. Some chroniclers wrote that his skull was mounted as a trophy in Adrianople, a warning to all who would oppose the Sultan. Yet others insisted the head had been lost in the chaos, its fate as uncertain as the rest of his remains. No single story prevailed. Among Christians, whispers multiplied. Some said his body had been trampled beyond recognition, mingled with the thousands of dead on Varna's plain, buried in a mass grave without ceremony. Others believed his corpse had been spirited away by loyal soldiers, hidden in secret so that no enemy could desecrate it. Still others clung to stranger tales, that the king had survived. Those tales carried their own allure. Across Europe, rumors spread of a wandering figure, scarred but alive, a king in exile living under another name. In Poland, peasants whispered that their sovereign would return one day, like a sleeping knight, to reclaim his throne. In Hungary, some insisted he had been taken captive, held in Ottoman lands, waiting for deliverance. Even decades later, men claimed to have seen him in Naples, in Portugal, in distant monasteries. Each sighting was another spark that kept the legend alive. This transformation from monarch to myth was not new in European history. It had happened before with King Arthur in Britain, with Frederick Barbarossa in Germany. But for Poland and Hungary, Władysław became their vanished hero, their king without a grave. His absence allowed people to imagine possibilities that his short life had denied. In the silence of his missing body, hope lingered, however faint. The Church, however, struggled with this ambiguity. Martyrdom required certainty. How could the Pope declare him a saintly king if no one could even point to his bones? Without relics, without proof, canonization was impossible. And yet, preachers still spoke of him as a sacrifice for Christendom, a youth cut down in the flower of life for the sake of faith. His story fit the rhythm of holy legend, even if history refused to close it. In Poland, the nobility moved quickly to fill the void. With no king and no heir, they turned to Casimir IV, Władysław's younger brother, who would eventually stabilize the throne. But even as a new king reigned, the shadow of the one who vanished hung over court and country. Władysław had been too young to leave a true legacy of governance. Yet his absence became more powerful than any policy. He was remembered not for what he did, but for what he symbolized. Promise destroyed, hope denied. In Hungary, the succession crisis deepened. Elizabeth of Luxembourg's infant son, Ladislas the Posthumous, became the rival claimant once again. Nobles who had once rallied behind Władysław now turned to the Habsburg child, hoping for stability through another fragile figurehead. The dream of a united Polish-Hungarian front against the Ottomans collapsed along with their king's body. And yet, the battlefield of Varna refused to let the memory rest. Travelers wrote of bones scattered on the plain years later, of rusting swords protruding from the earth. Local peasants claimed the ground itself was cursed, haunted by the spirits of the slain. In that haunted soil, the legend of the king who vanished grew deeper, nourished by silence and blood. The absence of Władysław's body also gave rise to political impostors. In later years, men appeared claiming to be the lost king, returned from captivity or exile. Some were quickly unmasked as frauds. Others gained followers, exploiting the longing for a sovereign who had not truly died. Each impostor was a reminder that the truth of Varna remained unsettled, that the wound of the missing body still bled in the imagination of Europe. To this day, no grave bears his name. No relic lies in Krakow's cathedral. The king of Varna exists only in chronicles, in ballads, in the whisper of waves against the Black Sea shore. His body may have been lost, but his story was never buried. Instead, it grew larger, more elusive, more haunting. There is something profoundly tragic in this absence. A boy who bore two crowns, who led armies, who died before he could become a man. And yet, in the end, he left no trace. His body was gone, his reign cut short, his promise extinguished. What remained was myth. The tale of a king who vanished into smoke, leaving Europe to wonder if he had died at all. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate. To die young is tragedy. To die without a body is to become a ghost. Though he died at 20, head lost, body vanished, Władysław III endures not as a ruler of laws, but as a symbol of youth consumed by the weight of crowns. His tragedy reminds us how faith, politics, and ambition can claim the innocent. History remembers him not for victories won, but for the fleeting hope he embodied, and for the silence that followed his fall at Varna.